Thanks for joining us today, everyone. Again, in the Legislative Building in Regina, we have Deputy Premier Gord Wyant and Chief Medical Health Officer Dr. Shahab. Joining us over the line from Saskatoon is Scott Livingstone, SHA CEO. Both Minister Wyant and Dr. Shahab will have brief opening statements, followed by time for questions.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of Premier Scott Moe. Today, there are 2 new cases and 2 more recoveries. So the active cases in Saskatchewan remain at 21. We're continuing to move forward with our Reopen Saskatchewan plan. Today, we're updating some of the guidelines and relaxing some of the restrictions on a number of activities in Saskatchewan, including sports and recreational activities, religious services and ceremonies like graduations, weddings, and funerals. This week's update to Reopen the Reopen Saskatchewan plan includes guidelines for activities opening in Phase 4.1, child and youth day camps, outdoor pools and splash pads, and outdoor sports and activities. All these new guidelines can be found at the Reopen Saskatchewan plan on the government's COVID-19 website, so just Google Reopen Saskatchewan. We aren't quite ready to announce a date for Phase 4.1, but you can expect that announcement will be made early next week. In the meantime, parents and organizers can be assured that kids' sports and other activities will be going ahead this summer, so that you can start to plan for that with a starting date coming very soon. Like everything else, it's going to look a little different. Like no tournaments or interprovincial travel for sports, teams, and no handshakes. While the risk of transmission outdoors is lower, there's still a risk. So we want to reduce that risk and keep everyone as safe as possible, while at the same time making sure everyone has the chance to enjoy our pools, sports, and other outdoor activities during our great Saskatchewan summer. After discussion with many Saskatchewan faith leaders and Dr. Shahab, we're increasing the number of people who can attend worship services to 30% of a building's seating capacity, or 150 people, whichever is less. All other physical distancing and safety guidelines for places of worship must still be followed, including keeping family groups seated together and separated by at least 2 meters. Now, many grade 12 classes have been finding new innovative ways to celebrate their graduation, like virtual parades, virtual services, and car parades. Under the new guidelines, graduation ceremonies can be held outdoors with a maximum of 30 grads and 150 people in total, including the students, parents, staff, and other guests. For graduating classes of more than 30, multiple ceremonies can be held. And of course, everyone needs to continue good physical distancing and distancing practices. Other types of outdoor ceremonies, like weddings and funeral services, can also go ahead under similar guidelines. No more than 150 people and everyone physically distancing. And as I said earlier, outdoor activities are far safer and have less risk of community transmission. But again, there still is risk. So we all need to keep doing our part to keep ourselves and our family and our friends and neighbors as safe as possible, while enjoying the kinds of activities, sports and pools and graduation and weddings that are so important to the great quality of life that we all enjoy here in Saskatchewan. So I'll now ask Dr. Shahab to make a few comments.
Thank you, Dr. Premier. Thank you. So I'll just maybe reinforce a few things that we've been saying all along. So as Minister Wyant mentioned, there's lots of opportunities now, both outdoor and recreational, as well as to celebrate and grieve and attend worship services. But I think the principles that have served us so well so far are things that we need to continue practicing as we move forward. So, of course, physical distancing, whatever we are doing, wherever we are, whether engaging in economic activity, shopping, engaging in many of the opportunities, as much as we can, physical distancing remains really important. Within groups, and when we have larger groups, having that cohort of 30 in an outdoor gathering where we have physical distance between households within that cohort of 30, and if it's a larger event like a graduation, groups of 30 should be separated from other groups of 30, so that in case there is an issue, it's limited to groups of 30. So that's one key recommendation that I would like to emphasize. Similarly, hand washing, if kids are out on the playgrounds, washing or sanitizing hands before and after play, not going out to an event, even if it's an important event, if you're unwell. I think those are principles that have served us well so far, and we really want to reinforce that going forward so that we minimize the risk of a transmission event happening at these events. So we are going back to larger and larger events, but we don't want to go back to what we saw in March. We want to go forward in a way that we can minimize the risk of transmission happening. And finally, as we think about having social gatherings, which may be not just grads, but maybe other family events, I think we need to remember that small, infrequent interactions are important rather than large, frequent gatherings. Outdoor gatherings, we can observe physical distancing are better than indoor gatherings, especially during the summer. We need to take advantage of the summer. Meeting more or less the same group is better than meeting a lot of new people. So we already talked about expanding our virtual household to 4 or 5 households, 4 or 5 friends, and similarly for gatherings, trying to observe those principles, unless, of course, it's a special event where, family may be coming. And whatever interactions we have, whether it's indoor sports, outdoor sports, having those interactions locally rather than across a larger geography, I think is all important. Those are all steps that we think all of us can try to achieve as much as we can, so that as we open up and enjoy more social interactions, more recreational interactions, as well as obviously reopening the economy, we do want to keep the risk as low as it is currently for as long as we can, and really enjoy the summer. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll take our first question from the phone line, operator.
We have Adam Hunter with CBC.
Good afternoon. The worship guidelines went into effect on Monday, and today's Thursday. We have new guidelines. What happened? I'm assuming the risks that existed on Monday exist today. So can someone explain why such a drastic change in just a couple of days?
Sure, I'll start with that, Adam, and I think Dr. Shahab maybe have another comment. Certainly, there's been a lot of ongoing consultation with leaders in the faith community. It's important, of course, that people of faith get to celebrate and worship the way they want. Certainly, these facilities are fairly large, and we believe, after some consultation with faith leaders, that there is significant opportunity for physical distancing within those large worship spaces. So that's really the reasoning behind the change that's been made.
Do you have a follow-up, Adam?
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Dr. Shahab on this as to the rationale behind allowing up to 150 people in the church, let's say, but not a movie theater or an outdoor concert or even kids to play in larger numbers.
So as our risk remains low, guidelines for other recreational activities will be coming, and as was discussed in the past, there may be some restaurants where the capacity may be 200 and they can operate at 100. But I think what is important is that we look at some key principles at how big is the space, like Mr. Wyant mentioned, how much does it allow, and then we've put some limits, a cap of 150 or 30%, whichever is lower for places of worship. And then who is going there, and is it an older demographic with risk factors or a younger demographic that may be going to a graduation event, although they may have household members attending also. And then what is happening there? So we know that social interactions where there's food and close mingling are more riskier than social interactions where you can maintain physical distancing. So certainly for worship services and graduation events, at the moment our recommendations do promote physical distancing between cohorts of 30, and then as the guidelines state in some detail, we really want people who are organizing worship services or graduation events to have a bigger separation between cohorts of 30. And we feel this will allow the events to happen in a way that is safe or safer, as safe as can be given our current low transmission, but not run the same risks as a large gathering without some of these considerations.
I might just add, Adam, these are very much worship services, very much structured routine events, and I think it lends itself quite well, I think, to an increased capacity within those areas, especially given the fact that there is some significant capacity. We're leaving it at 30%, though, and so that's still the number that needs to be complied with.
We'll take our next question from the room here, Arthur.
This is somewhat related, but just this week, Dr. Shahab, you said that 30 at this point you felt would really be pushing the boundaries of what might get us back to the kind of exponential growth that we were seeing early on in this crisis. So how can going up to 5 times that level right now with some activities be squared with the comments that you made this week?
So the way we have designed the guidelines and the way certainly we have visualized it is exactly that what some of the modeling work and some of the literature that has emerged from events that have happened in Europe or other parts of the world show that the bigger the group and the bigger the mixing, the higher the risk. So if you have the same people meeting weekly, so for example in a worship service, if you go and sit at the same place and it's always the same 30 people sitting in that location, physically distant among households, that's safer than random mixing. But then if you have enough space where you can separate that cohort of 30 by maybe another 5 meters with another cohort of 30, you can still have more people up to 150, but have that ability to have individuals cohorted at an event. And if it's a weekly event, try to have the same individuals at the same locations. And we feel that's a safe way to allow bigger gatherings, but with some safety considerations built in. And we will see, I think this could be a safer way to allow larger events and minimize the risk of transmission. But obviously we will have to monitor and make sure that it remains a safe way of continuing with our current low numbers. And of course, in future, if our numbers went up again, we would have to reconsider then as well.
You have a follow-up, Arthur?
This would be for the Deputy Premier. Can you just talk a little bit more about the engagement that you had with faith leaders? I mean, what particular challenges did they bring up with the 30-person limit? Was there a particular religious group that said that would cause difficulties for them? And just how did those engagements go?
Well, there's been a general engagement with the faith community, and there's been leaders that have come forward to talk to us through the business response team representing a large cohort of faith leaders around the province. And so generally speaking, we've been having those conversations with that group, and so a representative group of faith leaders around the province. Certainly, they've been hearing from their constituents about the need for them to express their religious faith through ceremony, and that was causing some difficulty for a number of their parishioners, a number of the people within their parishes, or mosques, and so. That's really where the conversation generated from, and as a result of those conversations, the limits have been changed. But certainly based on some pretty good conversations, some pretty good input that we received from faith leaders. So it wasn't just one faith, it was generally a representation of faith leaders who had made the representations to us.
We'll take our next question from the phone line, operator.
We have Mark Smith with CTV.
Hi, several provinces, including Alberta and BC, have released return to sports plans, and Saskatchewan has lower COVID numbers. Why is it taking so long to get that out, and will sports like football be included in the return to sports?
So we are developing guidelines which some of them have been released today, some are being developed. The dates will be announced next week. And again, every province have had a slightly different reopening plan. We had to structure it in a way that we can reopen one sector, watch for 2 or 3 weeks, make sure everything is fine. And I think it's important that we stick to our schedule, which may be a bit different from other provinces. And, obviously it tests the patience of some sectors who may be coming a bit later than other sectors. But I think we are committed to reopening basically all events which don't allow large crowds by phase 4, and the dates for those would be announced next week. And also, I think we have built into that some considerations where outdoor events we already know are less risky. Individual training is less risky, where you can maintain that physical distancing, but we'll have to give some consideration to teams who have to compete against one another, where again, the virtual bubble concept, where you may have 2 or 3 teams locally where you can engage within that bubble, but certainly some cautions around traveling within the province or interprovincially, obviously at this time. And the other thing I would like to say is that within Saskatchewan, obviously, the longer we go without high transmission numbers, the longer we stay under 1 with our effective reproductive number, the more it enables us to continue to move forward. But also, we're also informed of what's happening in our neighboring jurisdictions in terms of our collective risk in Western Canada and nationally as well.
Do you have a follow-up, Mark?
Yes. Is there any consideration being given to speeding up when Phase 4, Part 1 comes into effect to allow for sports to be out and kids to get out and play sports sooner?
Yeah, I think early next week we'll be able to give some firm dates and deadlines. Obviously, we need to make sure our guidance promotes a safe reopening of outdoor sports as well as indoor recreational sports activities, and obviously people who then have to enable that need some time. So that discussion is already happening this week and even earlier than this week, and that will continue over the weekend, and we can certainly firm up some dates early next week. But again, our desire is to go as early as we can feasibly go, while having this buffer between Phase 3, some additional activities announced today, which are going to start, on Friday, and having a bit of a buffer for both some monitoring of how things are going and also the time to get outdoor and indoor sports activities ready to, open up in a slightly different and a slightly more structured way.
And we'll take our next question from the phone line, operator.
We have Dan Jones with MBC.
Yeah, good afternoon, Minister. How can you explain to me, please, how these new regulations are not discriminatory towards people who are looking at getting married and/or holding a graduation?
Well, what the guidelines are intended to apply to are ceremonies, and so to the extent that there will be the opportunity for people to engage in ceremonies, whether they're wedding ceremonies or graduations, I think that they're pretty fair, especially given the fact that the justifications that have been given by Dr. Shahab with respect to moving them forward.
You're allowing one group to form or to gather inside for 150 people or up to 150 people, but you're not allowing 2 other groups or multiple groups really to do the same thing in an indoor facility that may be just as large as a church. How is that not treating everybody equally in these guidelines?
Well, Dan, what I said earlier was that when it comes to religious ceremonies, these are very much structured and routine, and so there are guidelines in place with respect to how religious ceremonies will be conducted. So, to that extent, I don't think that I don't think that they're being discriminatory to any one particular group. But I do think that as we move forward, guidelines will continue to be reviewed by Dr. Shahab and his public health officials to determine whether or not we need to move forward or change any of those particular rules around any of those events. Dr. Shahab, did you want?
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, and I appreciate that sometimes they can seem complex and but what we are saying is that you can have ceremonies and celebrations up to 150 in cohorts of 30, so that can include a wedding celebration, but at this point it can't include 150 people mingling among themselves and food at a buffet and a dance maybe. That unfortunately we aren't confident that we can see that happening at this point. And I think we all need to recognize that we are just in our 3rd month of really coming out of a significant pandemic nationally and globally. Of course, many countries are still in the throes of it. And we also need to recognize that we are in our maybe sixth week of really low numbers in a sustained way for most of the province. So I think having celebrations where you can have up to 30 people in groups of 30, we feel is safe. And certainly we are leading in many ways in most of Canada, but we want to do that in a way that we can enjoy these celebrations and significant events in a safe way. But, I think there's been lots of concern in Canada and throughout the world in banquets where, transmission has happened even in Saskatchewan in the recent past. And we'll still have to think through how some of that can be managed while our numbers remain low. But certainly celebrations where food or banquets aren't involved can certainly happen. And again, a lot of people give the example of restaurants, that how come a restaurant with a capacity of 200 can have 100 people, but you can't have a banquet of 100. And again, I think we have to recognize that, restaurants are working very differently. They don't have banquet tables or self-serve tables. They have six people at a table with every alternate table empty. You can't pull tables together. And while that seems to be very different, that does allow restaurants to operate in a way that is as safe as we think we can make this activity, which is very pleasurable. So I think we all need to have some patience to allow these things to move forward in a way that allows us to reassure ourselves and people who organize these events and participate in them that this is safe before we move forward. Because again, no one wants to hold a celebration where transmission happens, where people fall ill, and we've seen that happen in other parts of the world. So, we need to have the patience to move forward in a systematic, safe way, get the confidence to have some of these events before moving further.
We'll take our next question from the room. Mickey, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's kind of off topic, and I apologize for that, but I'm just wondering if the government is anticipating any financial pressure on school divisions when classrooms reopen, and will that be reflected, if so, will that be reflected in the budget on Monday?
Well, we've had this conversation before, and I think that what we're going to do is we're going to be looking to school divisions to determine what additional resources they may need to meet the requirements, the public health requirements that will be coming forward in the next couple of days. We're going to have that conversation with the school divisions. We don't know what that number is going to be, and as I mentioned the other day, certainly that has to be assessed against what savings the school divisions have had over the last number of months, given the fact that they've had perhaps some reduced plant expenses, transportation expenses. So this all has to be brought together to determine what those resources might be, but our goal is to ensure that instruction in the classroom is not impacted by any additional restrictions or rules that are imposed on school divisions as a result of going back in September.
Some school divisions are already running deficits. Is that of a concern in the state that we're in? And considering that there are going to be additional expenses possibly for busing and PPE?
Well, we know that there's going to be additional expenses for busing, certainly, and depending on what the rules that are imposed in September around social distancing, around PPE and those kinds of things, we'll know we'll determine what those costs were. I haven't seen any of the budgets of the school divisions. They're not due till the end of the month, so I haven't seen them, so I'm not sure what the circumstances are with respect to any one particular school division. But certainly the budget that was proposed to be tabled last March was going to be the largest education budget in the history of Saskatchewan, and so we think that we're providing the resources to school divisions that school divisions need to provide the instruction in their classroom. But again, we're going to be looking to school divisions as we approach September to determine what they might need in addition to that, having regard to the fact that, as I've said, there would have been some savings in school divisions as a result of the suspension of classes a few months ago.
We'll take our next question from the phone line.
We have Jada Noyes with the PA Herald.
Hi there, this is for Dr. Shahab. I'm curious why museums and galleries, where people are normally fairly distant anyways and you're kind of told not to touch, why are they not allowed to reopen until the second half of Phase 4 while gyms, for example, are in Phase 3?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the way the plan was designed was that individual activity that happens in a way that you're physically distant and there's attention to sanitation was allowed to go first, and that's how some of the gyms operate, even though they may have small group classes as well. And while it's correct that you can, in museums and galleries, you can go in a way that you are not supposed to touch multiple surfaces, but potentially that can have larger groups coming in, and during summer it can be busier as well. So that just needed a bit of thought and planning around how that will work. And obviously, as galleries reopen, specific guidance would be around, increased sanitation, hand washing, not visiting if you're sick, and some way of breaking up visitors in a way that you don't have a lot of close gathering in front of certain parts of the gallery or popular exhibits. So some thought will be given to that as well. And phase 4, as long as things remains quiet, is coming very quickly. So I think we can really hope to, in fairly short order, having phase 4.1 and 4.2 starting.
Follow-up, Gita?
Yeah, I have a question for Minister Wyant. The French-Canadian Society of Prince Albert says it's kind of at a standstill with the new Francophone school in PA. It says it's met every requirement from you, but the ministry hasn't moved forward on it. So I'm just wondering why that is and what your plans are with the new Francophone schools in the province moving forward.
Well, a couple of years ago, we signed a memorandum of understanding, I guess it was last year, with the CEF with respect to the construction of a number of new schools in the province. They had a demand required for a new school in Regina, Prince Albert, and Saskatoon. It's certainly the government's intention to comply with the provisions of that memorandum of understanding. In the meantime, there had been an opportunity, and you're familiar with the Rivier Academy in Prince Albert, as to whether or not that could be a suitable site for a new school in Prince Albert. And we have been looking at that. It's certainly a very large facility with a lot of area, a lot of space. I mean, there's a swimming pool in there and a lot of other things. And so we want to make sure that to the extent we can put together a viable business plan for the operation of that facility, which would accommodate a new French school in Prince Albert, we want to do that. Just this last week, we've commissioned a third party to put together an independent business plan to see whether or not locating a school in that particular facility makes sense from a financial perspective. That said, as I've said, we have signed a memorandum of understanding with the French School Board on the construction of 3 new schools in Saskatchewan, and we certainly will comply and live up to the obligations that we've set out in that memorandum of understanding to the extent that we can. So that's really the state of affairs with respect to new French schools in the province.
And we'll take our last question from the room. Arthur?
So we're getting pretty close to the time where high school graduation will actually be taking place. I mean, it's likely just a couple of weeks away now. Why were you not able to give school divisions more lead time on this? Because they've likely been planning under the current guidelines. These ceremonies are not simple to organize. We've known for weeks now that cases are down. Why is this only coming now?
Well, this is, I'll let Dr. Shahab add to these comments, but really what we look to is advice from public health when it comes to planning the reopening. And I think the advice that we've got from Dr. Shahab, I think you would agree, from Dr. Shahab in public health has been excellent advice. And so to the extent that we rely on that advice to plan these events, to plan how we're going to reopen the economy, I think that's fair. And so to the extent that we've done Dr. Shahab and his group have done some more analysis on this area, that's why the changes have been made. And so we know how important it is for graduates from grade 12 to celebrate. It's an important milestone in their life. And so I was pleased to see that Dr. Shahab and his colleagues have given more consideration to this, having regard to the fact that we're getting more and more requests for this. But there have been a number of innovative solutions that have come to this. We've had people planning virtual graduations, parades, those kinds of things. Because we know how important it is, and we're thankful that people are being innovative in the ways that they try to celebrate what is, at least at this point in their life, a very, very important milestone. So I'm thankful to Dr. Shahab and his colleagues for being able to provide some more input into this and to provide some more flexibility. But I'll let Dr. Shahab make a further comment.
Yeah, thank you. And I just say that, obviously we already know many people who have graduated virtually. And certainly, even graduating virtually should not diminish from the fact that anyone who's graduating from school or post-secondary is a tremendous milestone and achievement. So when you graduate and which phase you're in should not diminish from your personal achievement and sense of satisfaction. I think that's just something I just wanted to make that point. And same applies to, people may have not had the opportunity to grieve or to pray or do other or celebrate the same way as they have now. A month ago they wouldn't have had that, and that should not take away from whatever was possible a month ago was based on the situation then. And then when we developed when we went into lockdown in March, April, obviously a few weeks after that, the reopening plan phases were developed, but we could not predict where we would be till we were in that. And I think, it was something that we had to see happening. Phase 1 successful, no increase in transmission. Phase 2 successful, no increase in transmission. Phase 3 now continuing, no increase in transmission. But we actually had to see that, and actually a lot of it goes to the members of the public, the business community, the sectors that are reopening, that things seem to be working for the most part in a way that people are very considerate to each other. They're following the guidelines, and they are keeping transmission low. But it actually has to happen and be observed before you have the confidence moving forward. So I think that explains a lot of why things had to be phased. And now, as of this week, we feel confident in saying that yes, we can go up to 150 in cohorts of 30, indoors for worship services or other celebrations, outdoors for graduations. But we can say that now, based on what we've seen in the last 4 weeks, we couldn't have said that 2 weeks or 4 weeks ago.
Follow up, Arthur?
I'll shift gears while I have the Deputy Premier here. I just wanted to ask about the upcoming session. I mean, obviously the latest polls show that your party is still well ahead in the last session that we're going to have before the campaign. What do you think that your party needs to do this session to prevent the NDP from making an impact and making up some of that territory, making up some of that ground?
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, certainly we want to move forward and get our budget passed and answer some of the questions that the people of Saskatchewan have. I mean, I think the whole idea of ensuring that there is transparency and accountability on behalf of the government, and I think the people of Saskatchewan will be quite happy with hearing the answers to the questions that we're going to be having in question period, and the accountability of the government not just on the fiscal side, but on the way that this government has dealt with the pandemic over the last number of months. And so, our position at this point in time will be getting our message out to the people of Saskatchewan. I think as to how we've dealt with the pandemic, how we dealt with the fiscal realities of this province, and I think the people of Saskatchewan will react very positively to that, as they have in the past.
Thanks very much for joining us today, everyone. That concludes our time.